welcome back to Skeptics and Seekers. This is a special supplemental edition. I'm your host, Dale, representing the Christian or Seeker side, and this is going to be Shroud Wars Round 4. Once again, the audience is lucky you don't have to listen to me. I've brought on two experts. So we have from last week, Hugh Farey, and we also have a different Pro-Shroud expert this week. So Joe Marino, welcome back. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Excellent. So, yeah, we're going to have a good discussion. There's going to be a section on the dating of the shroud and specifically the carbon-14, because we heard Bob Rucker's take last week, but Joe Marino has a different take, the invisible reweave hypothesis. So we're going to be going back and forth on that a bit. As well, we're going to discuss image-forming mechanisms, and then we're going to get into the final topic, which I'm excited to discuss, because I haven't done a shroud debate on the forensic or medical evidence specifically. So that's going to be something new for the audience to hear a debate on that. We'll get straight into it. Just in terms of a basic introduction, Hugh Farey, why don't we start with you? Why don't you give us sort of an introduction as to who you are and your interest in the shroud?
Okay, right. Thanks very much. Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for allowing me on twice in a row, which is very exciting. Mm-hmm. The other great thing about this is that although we expect to have a big battle here, as far as I know, Joe is another Roman Catholic. Is that correct, Joe?
I was born and raised Catholic, but I have no church affiliation right now.
Okay, fair enough. But at least it's quite common to try and pit a Christian against an evil atheist with horns coming out the tail, but at least we're both quite conventional Christians, which is great. I could just, for the benefit of people who weren't listening last time, been a Catholic science teacher at a Catholic school in England for 40 years. I was editor of the newsletter for the British Society for the Turin Shroud for about 5 years, and I've written a couple of papers called imaginatively The Medieval Shroud and The Medieval Shroud 2. And I'm thinking of writing another one. I'm going to call it The Medieval Shroud 3. Because I'm good at imagination. Anyway, that's about it.
Excellent.
I'm a skeptic. Yes, I'm the evil one in this discussion.
Yes, I think one of our listeners, Tyler B., refers to you as the Shroud Demon. Let's meet our new guest here on the Pro-Shroud side, Joe Marino. Why don't you give us a bit of an introduction as to who you are and how you got involved in the shroud and that sort of thing?
Okay. Well, as I said, I was born and raised Roman Catholic, but never actually heard of the shroud until 1977. I was agnostic at that point, and I was reading a lot of religion and philosophy, not just Christian, just across the board. And I saw a book on the shroud called The Fifth Gospel, subtitled, "Is This the Face of Jesus Christ?" And it had a picture of the negative face on the cover. And I thought, well, this looks like interesting reading. So I bought it and read it in one night. Of course, that was 1 year before the Stirp scientists went over to Italy. And just on the initial reading, I was fairly convinced that it could be authentic. And I started collecting everything I could get my hands on, and I've continued that to this day. My basement is full of shroud materials, hundreds or thousands really of books, articles, correspondence, memorabilia. I probably have one of the best 2 or 3 personal English language collections of shroud materials in the world. And I've read all the major material in English. Probably the only thing I haven't read is some fluff on the internet. And that's just hard to keep up with nowadays, of course. And so after I read the book, I started keeping a file of materials, and then I contacted the Holy Shroud Guild for some slides. And then it played a factor in, I joined a monastery in 1980 in St. Louis, my hometown. And once I got to the monastery, I put together a lecture and started lecturing extensively in the St. Louis area. And I started corresponding with the scientists and researchers. I went to my first Shroud conference in 1986. In 1997, my late wife, Sue Benford, called me wanting information on Shroud. One thing led to another, and I left the monastery, married Sue later. We've done some research. We did what I think some significant research on the Shroud, especially the C14 area. And Sue unfortunately passed away in 2009, and I've been continuing my work. And I think I've been to 10 conferences, and the one coming up in Canada in August, I think will be my 11th, and I'll meet Hugh there for the first time in person. We've only communicated by email and on blogs and the Shroud Science Internet group. And I like to keep up to the minute on the Shroud. It's just been a fascinating topic for me. It grabbed me from that first book I saw, and it's never let go.
Absolutely. Perfect. Yeah. And so the Joe Marino mentions there's an upcoming conference. I don't know if anyone's in the Toronto region, but that's being held in Ancaster in this August. So if anyone's in the area and interested in checking that out, I highly recommend you give that a shot and show up for that. Let's get straight into the first topic of our debate. And so this is going to be, again, relating to the dating of the Shroud. And this is going to be, Joe Marino is going to initiate this topic and give sort of, in 10 minutes or less, give sort of your opening statement about, topics relating to the dating there.
Okay. Well, originally, Sue and I thought that the dating might have been off because of whatever caused the image. But Sue got an insight, I guess probably in 1999, that it could have been a repair. So we started looking into all my materials, since I basically had, all the written materials in the basement, and we, of course, could get on the internet as well. And we started to find a lot of historical evidence, and then later scientific evidence, that there could in fact be a reweave there. And so we put together a paper that we read at the International Conference in Orvieto, Italy in August 2000. That was organized by Emanuele Marinelli in Italy. And we had 30 minutes to present it, which I didn't feel was enough. And then with a couple minutes to go, the Italian moderator said something, and I didn't understand Italian, even though my last name is Marino. And I thought he was saying, "Your time is up." So I zipped through the last 2 minutes and found out later he was saying, "You have 2 minutes to go." But anyway, I can kind of highlight some of the findings we found then, and then additional findings that I have found over the years. So I've been researching this about 20 years now. And the Turin Commission, which studied the Shroud in 1969 and 1973, there was a researcher named Enzo Di Lorenzi. And in the report that they put out, he said, "I should like to mention the impression I've received during the course of my examination, namely that more pairs of hands have carried out the adorning than is suggested in the historical records." And when Giovanni Rigi took the sample in 1988, he cut some foreign fibers away, and that's stated in one of his books and elsewhere. And then when Oxford got their sample, Edward Hall noticed some fibers that were out of place, and he sent it to a lab in Derbyshire. And Peter South of the lab said that it may have been used for repairs at some time in the past. And then we found people that said that a medieval restorer could have rewoven the shroud to a standard not visible to the naked eye. And Professor Reyes, who was given a sample in 1973, stated that he found cotton there, and it was contained inside the threads. So, the shroud is supposed to be all linen. And then there was a big conference in Paris in 1989, and the French C-14 scientist Jacques Gavin was there, and he was asked a question about possible foreign fibers, and he said that he agreed that the labs didn't take the weaving techniques into account, and they didn't date the threads per se. And so he said if the weave was rewoven with threads from a modern restoration, this would be reflected in more modern results. And we found lots of other evidence. A Belgian chemist noticed that the chi-square test for the shroud was 6.4, and it's supposed to be lower than 6. And so the fact that it's higher than 6 indicates that the subsamples did not come from the same representative sample. And a Swiss archaeologist, Maria Grazia Ciliato, gave a paper in 1993 mentioning all the different types of mending techniques that had been performed on the shroud over the years. Dale, how long have I gone already?
You got about 6 more minutes if you want it. And you don't have to go for 10 minutes. If you want to end early, it's up to you.
All right. Well, I can probably go more than that, but okay.
That's fine. And I won't be too straight. Like, if you need a couple extra minutes, that's fine. No problem.
Let's see. And then 1996, the late Al Adler, chemist for blood specialist on STIRP, said in an article or an interview, so you can talk all you want about how reproducible the data is, but you can't talk about how accurate it is. You have no way of knowing if the area you took the C14 sample from represents the whole cloth. That's an area which has obviously been repaired. There's cloth missing there. It's been rewoven on the edge. They even cut part of it off because it was obviously rewoven on the edge. The simplest explanation why the date may be off is that it's rewoven cloth there, and that's not been tested. And then in a later paper in 1996, he said the patterns are all distinguishably different from one another, clearly indicating differences in their chemical composition. In particular, the radiocarbon samples are not representative of the non-image samples that comprise the bulk of the cloth. Now, in 1998, and there was an exhibition in Turin that year as well as a scientific congress, the scientific advisor to the cardinal at the time, Cardinal Pilate, had just come out or wrote a booklet in 1998. Savarino. Anyway, the advisor said that the testing might have been erroneous due to, and this is a quote, extraneous thread left over from invisible mending routinely carried out in the past on parts of the cloth in poor repair, end quote. And then he went on to emphasize, if the sample taken had been the subject of invisible mending, the carbon dating results would not be reliable. What is more, the site from which the samples actually were taken does not preclude this hypothesis, end quote. And then Adler presented a paper in 1999 at the Richmond Congress, which indicated that the C14 sample area and had different chemical characteristics than the rest of the shroud. Then it was in 2000, Sue and I presented our paper. Barry Schwartz published the paper on his site, shroud.com. And Ray Rogers, the chemist, the head of the chemistry aspect of the STIRP study, kind of had been out of the shroud study. He basically had believed the 88 results but a new book that had come out at the time, and also the paper that Sue and I did, kind of drew him out of retirement. And Ray was kind of upset with Barry for publishing our paper because he called us part of the lunatic fringe. And he told Barry that he could prove us wrong in 5 minutes because he had some threads from the Rhea sample, which was right next to the C14 sample. And then he also had leftover samples from the main part of the shroud from the 78 study. So he said he was going to look at the two and then, prove us wrong in 5 minutes. And he ended up calling Barry back about an hour and a half later and said, I can't believe it. I think they're right. So we started, we showed some pictures to textile experts. We did not tell them that it was a picture of the shroud, and all three independently said that there were indications of repairs there. And then Sue and I continued our research, and we found a technique known in France in the medieval time called French invisible reweaving. And the shroud was owned by Margaret of Savoy at the time, and she had access to the best weavers in Europe at that time. I also now own 3 different manuals showing how French invisible reweaving is done. There's a gentleman named Robert Boudin who was the president of something called Tapestries and Treasures, which produced imported, exported, high-quality tapestries, including 16th century pieces. And we asked him if a 16th century weaver possessed the skill to invisibly repair textiles, and he said most definitely. And then Thomas Campbell of the Metropolitan Museum of Art said the 16th century weavers were magicians. Around 2003, Barry published some photos of some photographs Stirk took called the Blue Quad Mosaics. The guy who took the pictures, John Lohr, says that the different colors show different chemistries, and the C14 area shows a different chemistry than the main part of the shroud. Then in late 2003, Rogers received a leftover piece of the C14 sample, and I know the provenance or the chain of custody has been questioned, but I've got an email from him saying how he got it, and the chain of custody is strong. So he definitely had a leftover C14 sample, and he found the same characteristics in that he did in the Rhea sample. And he found the gum and the dye and the cotton, all things pointing toward a reweave. And then in 2005, he published his paper in Thermochimica Acta, and he says the area was coated with a yellow-brown plant gum containing dye lakes, and he says microscopic and microchemical observations prove that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the true age of the shroud. And the Centro in Turin first kind of questioned that, but then they soon came out and I don't know if they got orders on high or what, but they then said that that needed to be studied more.
Okay. And yeah, do you have more to say, or much more to say, or?
Just a little bit more.
Okay, I'll give you an extra 1 to 2 minutes. Okay, so yeah.
All right, then there's, we looked in some websites and stuff, places that did invisible reweaving, and there's a website called Without a Trace, and the head guy there is named Michael Ehrlich, and he said, today there is a modern time-saving technique called inweaving that would be invisible from the surface but easily recognizable from the back. However, the technique used in 16th century Europe called French weaving is an entirely different matter. French weaving involves a tedious thread-by-thread restoration that is indeed invisible. 16th century owners of the shroud certainly had enough material resources and weeks of time at their disposal to accomplish the task. And then, besides Rogers' findings, he gave his Reyes threads to John Brown, a microscopist in Georgia. He confirmed Rogers' findings. Some findings were given to a 9-person team at Los Alamos National Laboratories, and they confirmed the cotton, and they stated they believed it was from a repair. Of course, there's much more, but I think that's quite enough for now then.
Gotcha. And you'll be given an opportunity to, in the informal discussion period, you'll get a chance to bring up anything that you missed here. But yeah, first I do want to give Hugh a chance to give his sort of introduction or counter to this. So Hugh, I said 10 minutes or less, but if you need some extra, about 5 extra minutes or something like I gave to Joe, that's not a problem. So yeah, go ahead, Hugh.
Okay, right. Yeah, I've been scribbling like mad to try and to get some of the details down as a response to some of the things that Joe said. Some of which are quite reasonable, and I mean I thought his case was very well presented, except that in some cases I don't believe that that's actually what happened. I don't think there is evidence for invisible reweaving, which I'll come to after a while. Now, he started with 5 or 6 examples of the radiocarbon section was taken away, and the people who cut it out or looked at it found that there was foreign bits in it. I don't think that's an example of evidence of reweaving of any kind. So, for example, I mean, Enzo de Lorenzi, who said that more pairs of hands had a show in the patching of the darning of the shroud than we'd been led to believe or something. I don't know that we had been led to believe very much. But obviously you've got the Poor Clare nuns busy putting in their patches. We've got either them or possibly somebody else putting in extra patches, or at least from the fire, nothing to do with the carbon-14 corner. So put some extra patches because some of them occurred twice. Then you've got that lovely saint whose name I forget, who restitched all the patches with black thread because he didn't want his stitching to merge in with the rest of the shroud quite deliberately. Joe will probably remember his name.
Sebastian Valfrey.
That's the man. So he put lots of little black threads dotted around the shroud. Then, of course, we've got Giovanni Ricci, who had to cut away foreign fibres. Well, the thing was there that the rice sample had been cut out of the shroud, and it had then been restitched onto the backing cloth. And also, of course, the corner of the side strip has been missing, and that's all been stitched onto the backing cloth as well. So there was a massive, great rolled hem of all sorts of people's threads and cotton threads, which could have happened any time during the history of the shroud. Also, it's quite close to the bottom edge of the shroud, which again has been re-hemmed. It was folded over. It was stitched gently in place in order to fit frames and all sorts of things. So there was a lot of foreign material in that area, and no wonder Ricci had to cut away all the edges so as to leave what he thought was fair bits of shroud, which was uncontaminated by all the bits which were fairly obvious to see that had been put in since. The Oxford people, sure enough, they examined their piece looking for evidence of extraneous threads, and they found a tiny little black fibre. Now, the black fibre that they found, and they sent it off to Derbyshire to be found out to discover whether it was cotton or not. It wasn't a black thread. It was a fibre. It was thinner than a human hair. It looks more or less thinner than one of the fibres that make up one of the threads of the shroud. So it certainly wasn't a piece that had, that was part of the shroud or had been used to stitch it onto anything. It was a tiny extraneous fibre, which, as I say, yes, about 1/100th of a thread. Then we had, sorry, but I'm sort of rushing really. I could slow down because I've got plenty of time. The thing about the cotton. Now this is a real problem really, because I don't know that anybody has tested enough of the threads on the shroud for cotton to be able to make any kind of statement about how much cotton there is in it or not. I do know that Dr. Thibaut Heimberger took a thread, and goodness knows where he got the thread from, but Joe probably know, spread it out on a microscope slide and specifically counted the number of cotton fibers compared to linen fibers that there were in that thread. And I think his proportion was roughly 15%, something like that. And then also Giulio Fanti did exactly the same thing with another thread, and he got 5%. And then, of course, there was the thread that Robert Villarreal had a look at, because which he was given by Rogers, and this was the famous one that it was said to have been spliced because it was actually glued together with a blob of some kind of organic waxy substance like terpene. It fell apart, and Villarreal looked at both ends and said that both ends were cotton. So the amount of cotton on the threads, which have individual threads which have actually been tested to find out how much cotton they've got in them, varies from none through 5%, 15%, and 100%. Now, I don't know whether that's true of random threads taken from all over the shroud or not, and neither does anybody else, because it hasn't been tested. So the whole cotton problem is a bit of a mystery at the moment. I don't think we can learn anything either way. Then let me have a look and see. Yes, various people have said, oh yes, it's definitely invisible mending. And that has been my real bugbear. Invisible mending. Can it be that invisible mending is invisible? Was it Robert Goodman you mentioned, Joe? Is he
Robert Gooden.
Gooden. I've not got in touch with him, nor with Thomas Campbell. But of course, I do know that Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg, who was an expert on tapestry restoration, as we'll know, is she still alive? Bless her. Anyway, yeah, great. But she insisted that there was no invisible mending on the shroud of the radiocarbon sample. She also, rather hilariously, said that you couldn't possibly have invisible mending because you wouldn't be able to see what you were doing, because as soon as you'd done it, it would disappear. Which is sort of quite funny in an overall sort of sense. But when you look at it, you start thinking, gosh, that's right. I wonder how exactly it works. Anyway, if it's invisible, how do Robert Gooden and Thomas Campbell know that it's there? That's what I want to know, except possibly from accounts in books. Now, I have, as you know, got in touch with Ruth Gilbert, who is probably Britain's leading textile recreator, who has woven for me a piece of the shroud to Vial's, can't remember his first name, Vial's specifications, the person who quantified the exact weave and the number of threads per inch and all that sort of it. I've also got in touch with Hero Granger Taylor, who is from the early textile study group. She's our British expert on first century medieval textiles and things like that. She doesn't think there's any sign of a invisible weave on the shroud. I then sent a little piece of handkerchief with a hole in it to the British Invisible Mending Society and said, can you Britishly invisibly mend this so that it's invisible? And they sent it back, and it was very good on one side, but it was visible on the other. And when I reported this in Shroud Studies, I heard about this wonderful man, Michael Ehrlich of Without a Trace, who did invisible mending. So I sent him my hanky, and I said, I've got a little hole in here. I understand that you can mend things which are totally invisible. I don't care how much it costs. I want you to mend this hole as invisibly as it is possible to mend it. And I got it back, and it's very, very good. But on the back, it's fairly easily visible. And I published both those in the on Shroud Story, I think, and I certainly published one of them in the British Society for the Turin Shroud newsletter. The fact is, I will only accept, and I've got all these books, the French reweaving books, which clearly don't show that invisible mending is invisible. And I really cannot accept that there is such a thing as invisible mending unless somebody does some for me or produces some kind of evidence, a piece of medieval tapestry, something like that, which demonstrates that it's actually happened. Because I don't believe in it. I especially don't believe in it when it happens in one tiny corner of a piece of a cloth which has been battered away with massive great holes in it and stuck together with rather crude patches. Why spend a fantastically detailed time repairing one tiny corner when the big holes look as though they've been slammed together by a primary school person? Unless, of course, we discover that there's these patches all over the shroud and they've been mended all over the place. And I just find that virtually incredible. Now, I want to move on now to something which has puzzled me ever since I started corresponding with people on the shroud. And
I'm sorry, Hugh,
sorry?
Sorry to interrupt. So that was your 10-minute mark. So I'll give you an additional 5, like I gave to Joe.
I've got 2 more to go, I think.
Yep.
Oh, 1 more.
Go ahead then. Yeah.
And that's because I really want Joe to come back on this at some point, if not immediately. These famous, the blue quad mosaic photographs, which were, there were 4 of them covering the 2 top and bottom of the body image on the shroud, the front of the head and chest, and then the lower legs, and the back of the head, and the back, and the buttocks and lower legs. And 3 of them look almost identical. They are basically orange and yellow and red, and they have a broad blue stripe, a bright pale blue stripe across the top third. And they also have a sort of green patch down in the bottom left-hand corner. All of them, 3 of them, of the 4. Broad blue stripe across the top, little green patch in the bottom corner. Now, it is said of the one which covers the radiocarbon corner that the green patch is evidence of some different kind of chemistry, which it may be. But if it is, then the blue patch, which covers the whole of the top third of 3 of these things, must also be a different kind of chemistry. And nobody has answered me that, although I've asked it over and over again. If we put these 4 blue quad mosaic patches together so that they have the whole of the shroud, they cover the whole of the shroud, we find that the shroud must have 3 large blue stripes, I suppose about 30 to 40 centimeters wide, made of a different material from the rest of the shroud, if the different colors actually represent different chemicals. And no one's ever replied to that. Haven't said, no, well, I think it must be something else. They just haven't replied at all. And that's the last thing I wanted to say, really.
All right, perfect. All right, so what we'll do at this point, we're going to get into the informal discussion between Joe and Hugh here. Yeah, I mentioned we're not bound by time kind of thing, so you guys are flexible in that. So, we can go up to 20 minutes or something. If we reach that point, I'll let you guys know that it's 20 minutes and then let you guys have a couple extra minutes if you still have some final words to say. But yeah, we won't be limited to the 10 minutes thing if you guys want to go beyond that. So Joe, we'll hand it over to you to initiate the conversation and come back to Hugh there.
Okay. Well, now the points I'm raising, I'm going to have 75 minutes for in Canada, and of course I have slides with it. So if you can't catch everything now, and hopefully after the conference, the PowerPoint will be available somewhere. Another point I didn't raise earlier in my segment was the fact that the late archaeologist Paul Maloney presented a paper in Columbus in 2008, and he presented a list of individuals or groups that had found cotton inside of the fibers. This is what he claims in the Reyes corner. And he cited Gilbert Reyes. He cited Sturp's 1981 early analyses reported by their spokeswoman, Joan Janney. He has investigators at Precision Processes in England, Ray Rogers' 2004 investigations, John Brown at Georgia Tech, and Robert Villarreal. And then there's a textile expert from Thomas Ferguson Limited, who in 2016 wrote an article that's online, and she says yarns break during weaving. The success in identifying these breaks and fixing depends on the skill of the hand weaver. However, there are signs in the shroud sample that direct the notion of mending or reweaving of the actual woven fabric. So, yeah, at the moment I think Hugh and I might have some dueling textile experts. And I should also point out that the Savoy family archivist, the king of Italy, had owned the shroud up until 1983. And the archivist named Carlos Evaristo wrote a book in 2014. And he said, he's talking about the area where the sample was taken, and he said, the section could have been ordered or rewoven back onto the original hole, or else the section in question was substituted with another piece of similar cloth. And then he also says, also another fact confirmed by His Majesty was that it was traditionally affirmed that at one point in the past, the edges of the sheet had become so tattered as to cause embarrassment or criticism of the custodians, and those areas were repaired and rewoven using identical techniques, but obviously with similar yet newer materials containing dyes and other medieval manufacturing ingredients in an attempt to better blend the new sections in as best possible with the original fabric. So here you have the former owner of the shroud saying it was repaired. So, yeah, it would be nice to get something concrete in terms of an example, and perhaps we'll get that soon. But I checked.
Sure, yeah,
I'm not going to accept any. I can accept the sort of repairs that people occasionally mention, that they are the rolling up of the selvage and the rolling up of the hem. That sort of thing has been repaired quite a lot, and you can see it. I don't know if you've spent a lot of time browsing Alta Definizione's photographs, Shroud 2.0, but they are fantastically good for running your way very slowly all the way up and down all the seams on the shroud, where you can see how they've been rolled, how they've been hemmed, how in some cases where they've been taken to pieces. You can see all the holes where the original Holland cloth was sewn onto the main shroud. For example, the stitch holes are still there. You can see the drawing pin holes where it was pinned to its frame. So it's really detailed for that. Now, as I say, I'm just not going to believe in invisible reweaving until someone can demonstrate it to me. And I should be, I'd like to try and get hold of Mr. Campbell and Mr. Gooden and ask them, where is there a sample of this? How do you know? And where is there even a description of it? There is, this idea. How do you invisibly reweave something? Well, let's try and think of it in practical terms. What you have to do is you have to unravel all the threads for quite a long way, I think, and then you have to twiddle them with your fingers until they come into just little bits of fluff. And then you get the new piece of thread, twizzle that with your fingers till it comes into a little bit of fluff, and then sort of smudge the two fluffy ends together and maybe roll them around in your fingers and hope that that will make a strong enough join so that they don't then fall apart when you try and use them again to weave them back together again. And that just seems to me, I just don't think it's ever been done. I don't think there's any evidence that it's ever been done. I don't think there's any description that it's ever been done. There's just been various people going, oh, they were amazing, those people in the long time ago, they had lots of time. But I don't go for it. It didn't happen until somebody, I'm like Doubting Thomas, I'm afraid. Didn't happen until I put my fingers on it.
Well, I take his point that to this day, we don't have an expert example. But we'll, I think it's worth putting all the data out there and and we can hope that other researchers with the knowledge and expertise can hopefully come forward and add to the debate.
What did you make, out of curiosity? Hugh mentioned that nobody's ever responded to his take on the blue quad mosaic evidence. Did you have anything you wanted to come back on that front?
Not really. I'm no expert in that area. A lot of my take on the shroud is the weight of the evidence, and as I mentioned earlier on, I've read everything, and I think the weight of the evidence, and generally for authenticity, is more on the side of that it is authentic. But I kind of, in a lot of areas that I don't know much about, I say, well, the experts, most of the experts are saying this. And certainly for Stirp, I mean, I get a little irritated when people say Stirp was a group of religious fanatics, when that is simply not true. They had, a few Catholics, some Protestants, agnostics, Jews, Mormon, and they did not go over there intending to prove that it was the burial cloth of Christ. They went over there to find out how the image was made, and they couldn't answer that question, which kind of surprised them. But to me, the weight of the evidence for the general authenticity is strong, and I think there's enough evidence for the possible reweave that we need to still keep looking at that.
Okay, perfect. So just before we get to maybe having a quick discussion on some of the other evidences, Hugh, is there anything on the invisible reweave that you would like to ask Joe about, or you think we need to cover more?
Just one little bit, and that is that it's to do with the chronological gradient. So the invisible reweave. Now, I've got in front of me a thing which Joe perhaps doesn't use quite so much now, but it was a very early picture of a piece of the radiocarbon sample with a diagonal line along one of the herringbone spines, if you like, and the top purple edge is 16th century patch, it's written here, and the bottom yellow section is the original 1st century material. It doesn't matter. I mean, I don't think it can actually be just two bits of material butted together, because there'd be no way in which they would join. It would just fall apart. They must be mingled slightly.
Yeah.
But it's very apparent, looking at that spine, that there is much more mending towards the middle of the shroud than there was towards the end of the shroud, which is why, of course, it gets older as or the shroud apparently gets older as you go towards the edge of the shroud, and it gets younger as you go towards the middle of the shroud. This is the principle behind Bob Rucker's neutron hypothesis. Now, you'd have thought, and this was brought out at great length in the 2014 St. Louis conference, which I rather attacked, the idea that the reweaving on the shroud actually made the shroud look older, not younger, than it really was. Do you have something to say about that?
Well, I know, Arizona had dates 200 years apart. All I know that sample was not homogeneous, and it should have been if it was the original cloth. So, I mean, who knows how the original repairing was done and how much they did one area as opposed to another. I don't have much more to add besides that.
Oh, that's fair enough.
Fair enough, then.
Okay. Sorry?
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think that's me done for the time being.
Good stuff. Okay, and Joe, just is there anything else about the invisible reweave or the politics of the carbon-14 that you wanted to just mention before we move on?
Yeah, I can say a bit about the politics and the anomalous nature of the corner. The papers that you mentioned early on, a former NASA scientist and I, Ed Pryor, and he's agnostic, so he didn't have a religious bent. We put together in two parts 59 pages of material that suggested that that corner was suspect at best. And then in 2016, I wrote a three-part, 75-page article about the politics of the dating of the shroud. And if anybody that takes the time to read those, I think you'll see that the science and the rigor was very suspect. And even if my reweave theory is correct and they happen to get the date basically right, sans the reweave, I think the science was so poor and the rigor was so poor, anything that they came up with data-wise just has to be suspect, because it was not a rigorous scientific experiment in the least.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, one other thing. Does anyone, in terms of other evidence outside of the carbon-14, do you think there's any good evidence that we can use to suggest the shroud is in fact older than the medieval period? So, for example, Bob Rucker and Hugh were kind of discussing the art history and the numismatic evidence, but do you think there's anything else that's indicative of its age?
Yeah, I think Fleury Lemberg was quoted as saying that the stitching that she found on the shroud that matches Masada, and there are other places besides Masada, but her point was, she says, the style belongs to 1st century or before. So she firmly places it in 1st century.
I don't think she did. She said it was compatible with the stitching.
No, I've got an actual quote here where she says it belongs firmly to the period 1st century or before.
Well, I disagree with that, because
I got it in a quote.
Oh, no, I'm sure that's what she said. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm disagreeing with her. Okay. It's a very simple stitch for joining together two hems, and I think you'll find if you take the jeans apart, it's very much the same kind of stitch which is used for stitching jeans together. She's quite wrong that it's an odd kind of stitching. It's not unusual. It's simple and it's easy to do.
Well,
I've done it myself. So I disagree that there's nobody else that's ever done it.
All right, well then you can't use it to say that she says invisible reweaving can't be done.
I know, strange, isn't it? That's the way life is. Sometimes you agree with me, and sometimes you don't.
Fair enough.
One other point I wanted to bring up, and this is very speculative, I know, and this is another very, very controversial area of the shroud, is that coin on the eye. Some people think there's a Pontius Pilate coin, and what was interesting was that when they first thought it might be a Pontius Pilate lepton, which was minted 29 to 32 AD, they saw the letters UCAI. They thought they saw those letters, and the actual inscription on the coin of Tiberius Kaiseros should have been UKAI. But then they actually found, I think it's 4 or 5 authentic Pilate leptons that have that misspelled C. Now, if the coin's not on the eye, that's got to be one of the world's biggest coincidences, that they thought they saw a C on the shroud, and then at first thought, well, it can't be because it's supposed to be a K, and then they find actual misspelled C's. But I just wanted to make the point that that's another area that I would love to see more research on.
Have you read my article in the BSTS newsletter?
What about the newsletter?
I did a whole thing on the lepton, on that, by finding the marks on, as I say, on the latest, on the Alta Definizi Shroud 2.0 weave, and showing that the marks which are purported to be on top of the threads are actually shadows between the threads. It's easy to get this wrong. The people, and over and over again, people have got it wrong. Some of them making an innocent mistake, and some of them doing it on purpose. If you look at the the Giuseppe Enrique photos from 1931, they're very, very high contrast. And when people looked at them and they found the marks, the UKAI mark, these marks are in white on the negative, so obviously they would appear black on the positive. Am I making some sense there?
Mm-hmm.
So you can see these letters UK, or there should be YK, but anyway, UKAI, and you can see them there, and they're white. And if you turn them into the positive, they turn black. But by comparing them with the rest of the weave, you can see that those black marks are not on the threads. They are in the shadows between the threads. In other words, the whole of those letters are idiosyncrasies of the weave, and they're not on the top surface of the thread. So they couldn't have been put there by a coin. And I think if you read my paper, you'll agree. I recommend it.
I'll have to reread that.
Okay.
Anyway,
Great.
so I'm not keen on the coins. I'm not keen on the flowers. I'm not keen on the 2 crowns of thorns. I'm not keen on the chains, the hammer, the nails, the titulus, the 4 different kinds of papyrus writing that's been put there, and all the rest of it. It just gets completely bonkers after a while.
Okay, perfect. Oh, go ahead,
2
Joe.
thorns? Yeah. No, the things that people think they can see slowly go absurd, I think.
Okay, and sorry, Hugh, just what for the audience, say what was the name of that specific paper that you wrote?
That's Alan Wanger's book, Adventure. Oh, which one? My paper.
On the coin, yeah, the lepton.
It's called. It's in the last British Society of the Turin Shroud thing, and I've called it something, and I'm just trying to see whether I can find out what I called it. Something like magical leptons or something.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. I'll email it to you.
Okay, perfect. I'll put up the link for people. So, okay. So that's great. So let's move on to our second major topic here, and this is again getting into the image formation and asking really the broad question: is the shroud image an artistic image? So once again, we're going to go to Hugh to initiate. Huh? Sorry. So yeah. Well,
Yep.
all right.
I
Well.
mentioned quite all of this last time, so I'll try and make it slightly different.
Yeah, try. Yeah, let's see what you do. I like to see if you can mix it up a bit. But yeah, you go ahead and give your sort of opening statement.
Yeah.
Is the shroud an artistic image?
Oh, right. To my mind, the shroud was made by an artist. Now, I've tried quite hard, and I've looked at the paintings that have been done by Joe Nickel's team and by various other people who've had a go at just painting the image on the shroud. And I agree with people who think that it's probably unlikely that without any knowledge of a negative reversal, someone could have painted an image which reverses into what looks like a negative quite so elegantly. It's possible, I think, and one would like to get an artist who knew nothing at all about the shroud and give them a subject and say, can you pretend that a piece of cloth has been laid over that subject, paint in where you think it would make contact and where you wouldn't, and then see what result they got. It's difficult for everybody else to do it because if we know what we're aiming for, whereas it would be good to try someone who didn't know what they were aiming for. But on the whole, I'm not a painting person. A man with a paintbrush or something dabbing around on a piece of cloth, guessing where an imprint might have been made. I think we're probably pushing our luck there. What I am fairly keen on at the moment is the imprinting hypothesis. Now, you've heard this one before, and that is that you get a statue and you smear it with something and you cover the statue with a cloth, and the cloth peels off, and where the ink touches it, you've got a colour, and where it doesn't, you don't. The problem with that, of course, as everybody knows, is that if you wrap a piece of cloth around something that's three-dimensional, when you unfold it, things like the ears, instead of being close together, like, say, how close are my ears apart? 25 centimetres? They fold outwards until they're about 30, 40, 50 centimetres apart, and they look stupid. So for that reason, I don't think the cloth was draped over a statue. I think it was draped over a bas relief. So I'm imagining a piece of wood, probably about, I don't know, 4 or 5, maybe 10 centimeters thick, which has got a bas relief of the face and the body of the shroud on it. One of the reasons I think for that is that the hands folded onto the over the stomach, onto the groin, are much too flat on the shroud to be folded over a real person. So I think if you get a bas relief, and that doesn't just mean like a wood engraving. I don't mean a blank piece of wood which has got some scratches in it to mark out where the where the ink doesn't stick, because that way you'd all get an area of flat and an area of depression where there'd be no ink, and all the ink would either be there or not there. It'd be one or another. You wouldn't have any sense of pressure. But a bas relief has got real curves and contours to it, so that if you press a piece of cloth down on top of it, the bits which stick out more, like the bones of the fingers and the nose and the brow, will naturally make you put more pressure on them than you would on the bits down the side. And that way, I think a negative image could appear entirely fortuitously. So that's my method. You get your bas relief, you cover it with something, you stick the shroud on top, you pull it off, and essentially that's where the image is. So you then got the problem that the Stirk team found, that there isn't any, what do they call it, pigment or stains or dyes. They were pretty sure there was absolutely nothing on the shroud at all. They even tested it for dozens of different things, including starch, and I shall come to that in a minute, and decided that there was nothing on it, and that therefore the image was entirely due to the yellowing of the surface of the linen. And that yellowing, that yellowing looks very like a scorch mark, but we think that it's probably not a heat scorch mark. I think it's an acid scorch mark. So if there was any pigment, then the pigment has been washed off, and the scorch mark left behind is what's actually caused the image. And I think that's possible. I'm not sure I want to say anything more about that, except that the difference in intensity of the different parts of the image, I think, is not so much due to distance between the cloth and the bas relief, but to do with the pressure with which the cloth was pushed onto the bas relief. I'll probably think of something else in a minute, but that's how I think it was done at the moment. I mean, do you want me to go into why it was done like that, or what was the point of doing it in the first place?
Yeah, sure, sure. And I would also say, so you mentioned like the hands being flat, but is there, what's sort of the evidence that you think that we have at the moment that favors this, or is it just merely a possible hypothesis to your mind, or do you think that you have positive reasons to favor that it's an artistic image versus a naturalistic? Yeah.
Well, there are other reasons for thinking that the shroud is of that kind, and that is because why would you make, what's it for? Why would anybody do it? And of course, the first thing we think about is I can't remember whether it was Teddy Hall or Michael Type saying, "Oh, someone just got a piece of cloth, faked it up, and flogged it." But I don't think it wasn't made as a forgery. It was not made to represent an ancient relic. I think there's lots of good reasons to suggest that there was no intention of making it a relic. For a start, from the moment it was discovered onwards, people said that it couldn't possibly be a relic because it has an image on it. Because everyone knew that the shroud didn't have an image on it. And so by putting an image, I mean, if it was real, then obviously it did have an image on it. But by putting an image on it, whoever made it went against the current thinking of the time. So why did he put an image on it? Well, this, as I've mentioned before, so I won't go into it in quite so much detail, is part of a religious ceremony, a little trope that took place before Mass on Easter Sunday morning, when 3 clerics dressed as women went to one side of the church where there was a wooden box, or even a permanent tomb there. Some of the bigger cathedrals had a permanent tomb. where there was an angel sitting saying, Jesus has risen, take this shroud and show it to the people. And the clerics then went back to the altar and held out a shroud for all the people to see, and they all burst into song saying, Jesus is risen. So what did they actually hold out? Well, it had to be a sheet of some kind. And the sheet that would fit a large cathedral vest would be a long, thin one, not one that was like a shroud, which is more like a bed sheet shape. You put the body in the middle, and you wrap the bits around it, and then you tie it up with strips. And that's what a shroud is. That's what a body bag is. That's what everybody uses for wrapping up dead bodies. What you never use is a long, thin strip, which you lie the body on, and then fold it over. That wouldn't be any use as a shroud, but it would be very useful as a liturgical thing to hold up in front of all the people on Easter Sunday morning. A kind of, an imitation shroud, if you like, or a shroud adapted to a particular ceremonial purpose. And then, as I've said before, if you're going to put a body on it, a shape on it, and whoever was asked to do this was said, can you make an image like an imprint of Christ? It may have been a kind of enhanced Veronica. There were lots of places all over the place where all over Europe, where they had the Veronica. Well, they still do all over the place. Cloths which have the head of Jesus on it. So why not have all of him? Now, if you did that, you could put a picture of Jesus or a kind of imprint of Jesus in the middle of the cloth, but then if you held it big enough to hold out over the altar, you'd have lots of blank space on either side. So it'd be rather good if you could have two images of Jesus, a front and a back. That way you'd make the whole cloth neatly filled with image, and it would be artistically more satisfactory. The only trouble is that if you had a real body and you laid it down, I mentioned this last time as well, if you had a real body and you laid it down on a shroud, you'd put the head at the end and you'd put the feet in the middle. And the reason for that would be that when you folded the shroud back up over the feet, the head would be the last thing to be covered, which is what happens when dead bodies are covered with cloth. The head is the last thing to be covered, and if you want to have a look at the dead body and find out who it is, or identification, you just peel back the cloth from the head, and it's the first thing to be uncovered. And then with the shroud, of course, that would be completely the opposite. But artistically, it would make so much more sense to have the two heads in the middle, because they're much more interesting, and the feet at the far ends. Anyway, so that's why I think the shroud was arranged like that. And that would be the point of somebody being commissioned to produce a picture of the kind I suggested upon it.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, we'll turn it over to Joe now to give his sort of 10-minute introduction as to why he thinks the image isn't or can't be an artistic image outside of forensic evidences.
Okay. Can I ask you, in your view with that method, does that jive with Barry's transmitted light from the back, in which you can see the blood from the front, but you can't see any part of the image?
Well, as I say, if there's any pigment on it, then it's very, very fine. Either that, or it's been largely washed off. So you're just left with the degraded cloth and with no pigment. However, I will say that you can see through the back. I think you can see the water stains. You can certainly see some of the water stains on the X-rays, which suggests that they've got something fairly substantial in them, and I wonder what happened to them. Where they got all their density of material that can be seen both through the back of the cloth and via X-rays. But as I say, I think that I can't see any pigment. I've been looking for pigment and I can't see it. So I agree that there's not much pigment there.
Well, and I also would mention that, Barry Schwartz mentioned that his father died, I forget, 5 or 10 years ago, and they buried him in a shroud, and he didn't say that the orientation or anything was different about it. I got the impression, and I'll have to get more clarification about this, I got the impression that the way they buried his father in a shroud was not dissimilar, or not the same, was the same as what we see in the shroud.
Well, all I could say is that I've been on various websites where you can buy shrouds if you are Jewish or Islamic, and they tell you what the dimensions of the shrouds are, and none of them are long and thin. They're all sheet-shaped, as it were. So maybe Barry's father was buried in an unusual shaped shroud, but I don't think he was. I think it was a fairly standard one. Yeah, you can look them up and buy them, I suppose. Jewish and Islamic people, buy shrouds for that purpose all the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and it's just generally, I find it hard to believe that an artistic endeavor would just happen to get negative characteristics and just happen to get at least quasi 3D or spatial encoding characteristics, and that it can only be seen best from 6 to 10 feet, and it would have tons of characteristics that most scientists find very strange about the image. And I might say too that I think last week you said, a lot of people say that your method you haven't completely duplicated it yet.
No, right, yeah.
Yeah, and you also said that, well, neither has any of the pro-authenticity people, whether it be neutrons or Babelgraph or whatever. But I would say you've actually got the easier task, because if it is an artist, a medieval artist, you should be able to duplicate it at least at some point, whereas a pro-authenticity person who's trying to show that it comes from God, he or she is never going to duplicate it exactly. They can only approximate it. So I think you got the easier job there.
Oh, well, I have to agree with that. Actually, yeah. So that's why I gave Bob 5 years to sort his out, and I'm giving myself 5 months.
All right. And is your image going to be a full front and dorsal?
No, mine's going to be probably a tiny piece of material. But I couldn't possibly bring a full-size shroud to Lancaster. But I could bring something.
Well, invisible reweave, if you can't, until you do it, and playing devil's advocate here, if you kind of approximate it, can't people say, well, I won't believe it until you do a full-length front and back body image like we see on the shroud?
Yeah, I think that's slightly daft. People are always saying, you can't, unless it's exactly reproduced. I don't know that anybody has exactly reproduced anything. I mean, is the Mona Lisa a miracle because no one's reproduced it? Or the Great Pyramid of Giza? Or the Sphinx? How many times has people reproduced the Lincoln Memorial? It's never been reproduced. Therefore, it's a miracle.
Yeah.
To reproduce the whole thing is simply not sensible.
There are similar things to those where there is simply not anything similar to the shroud. I mean, it's absolutely unique. There's no other object with an image, a clear, distinct front and back image like it nor.
That's true enough, yeah. But I mean, my point is that if we can show how it was done, we don't actually have to reproduce the whole thing.
No, you'll probably get some arguments on that, but I understand that from your interview last week that you'll have to run it by Bruno Barberis, so it'll be interesting.
That's dead right, yeah. You probably know about it because I have to write learned papers for Barry, Bruno, what's her name, the lovely lady in who's interested in the archaeology of Ada Grossi is another one. So they've all got to get letters from me, or long, complicated essays from me, beautifully researched. Oh, Flavia Manservici, she's another one. So yes, I've got my work cut out, I can tell you.
Okay. Go ahead, Joe.
Mentioned that Thomas de Veselo, I don't know.
Yes.
He's an Oxford historian who specializes in 14th century art.
Yep.
And he, as an agnostic, has no religious bias. He says in his book and other things he's done that the shroud does not fit in to a 14th century um, milieu. So I think that carries some weight.
Yeah, well, it does, but he only considered two possible reasons for the shroud being made. It doesn't fit in to the concept of the shroud being a forgery, because there were so many people who, as soon as it was made, said it doesn't look like a forgery. It doesn't look like the real thing, for example. And he also went into it in terms of if it was meant to be a painting of Jesus. So he didn't look at it as if it was meant to be a religious artifact used in a religious ceremony. And I think that if he had looked at it in that respect, he might have found something a bit more technically, conceptually, and stylistically correspondent. Mind you, he's still around. Perhaps I ought to write to him. He doesn't seem to have done anything else since. He's disappeared into obscurity.
I had heard he might be writing a second book, but I haven't heard much recently. But do you think your medieval artist, would he have really gone against the conventions of the day and had a nude Jesus?
I'm busy working on that. I'm not sure that Jesus is nude. Again, looking really carefully, and this time at some of the Vern Miller photographs which have just been published in shroudphoto.com. Do you want to add that, Dale, to your list of references?
Mm-hmm. On the, what's the website? Vern Miller's photos is where?
Shroudphoto.com.
I think there's an S at the end of it, Hugh. I think it's Shroud Photos.
Gotcha.
Shroud Photos, is it? Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll put that in for people.
That's got a whole lot of photographs which were taken by Vern Miller in 1978. And some of them are very high contrast and extremely interesting. And the scourge, what people have always assumed are scourge marks running down the front of the thighs, I think are in fact wrinkles in a loincloth. I don't think Christ is nude.
Okay.
Not in the front. I think he probably is nude in the back, but I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Perfect. So yeah, that's Joe's opening speech. Now you guys have sort of been going back and forth in the opening speech. Did you guys have anything you wanted to say on this topic still, or to discuss about this, or did you guys want to move on to the forensic medical evidences?
I'm happy to move on, unless Joe wants to say something.
Just one or two more things. I also want to point out that there was a British sculptor named Leo Valla in the 60s who, I believe he was agnostic. He believed the shroud image couldn't be faked. So I think all these people that are not Christians.
On what grounds? I mean, just because he didn't think of it, or was he an expert in something?
He was an expert sculptor.
Ah, right, yeah.
Yeah, I think he wrote a few articles in the 60s or something, or there were at least a couple articles about his findings. I think maybe they quoted them. I haven't read those in eons, but
I'll check. Is that V-A-L-A?
Yes, Leo Valla.
I'll see if I. Oh, yeah. Hey, that's a new one on me. I think I'll have to look him up. Thanks for referencing it.
Sure. And then I just generally again, if an artist was talented enough to come up with the shroud that he did, I find it a bit amazing that he did it and then just sort of disappeared from history and we don't even know who it was. I just think it makes more sense that people, that it's authentic and people hit it because of that, and it was, it lays low in history during certain periods and only a few people have access to it. I just think there's just too many barriers for a medieval artist to come up with that and fool 20th and 21st century scientists, doctors, and researchers.
Well, there's a point there, but I think it's because he's been approached in the wrong way. I think people have thought, here is an artist, he produces a piece of art, and I don't think it was like that. If you look at all the artists in Europe, if you like, who produced some fantastic works of art, especially in large churches throughout Europe. 9 times out of 10, they have no name. We just don't know who produced some of the greatest artworks in medieval Europe. They're always called the master of something or other, or the sculptor of this. There are a few important ones, and they were probably important because they were working in either the Vatican or Avignon when the Pope moved there, or for royal courts, people like that. But for artists all over quite slightly second-rank cathedrals or something like that, we don't know their names. They just painted stuff because they were told to paint stuff. I think the other thing is that artists didn't have a studio in which they sat and they said, look, I've produced something, so I'm going to produce another one and another one and another one. They were paid by the bishop or the diocese and the church, and he said, right, we want a statue of Our Lady. Can you run one up? You've got a month to do it. So they would set off and do that. And then when they'd finished that, someone would go, right, we want this cloth for Easter. Can you put an image on the cloth? So we went, oh, right, yeah, okay. How would you like me to do it? I'll do it like an imprint. Is that okay? And they went, yeah, do that. So he did that. And then he moved on to something else. You know, they did what they were told. Carving, sculptors and things like that. A lot of them would do all of it. Sculpting and painting and leatherwork and all the rest of it. Because that's what their job was. They didn't even think of themselves as artists most of the time. The word artist is quite a modern word in terms of producing works of art. They would have thought of themselves as craftsmen.
Okay, perfect. All right, so yeah, I think we can move on at this point to the final topic, and this is the one, as I said, I'm most looking forward to this one because it's something that we haven't really done before in a discussion or debate type format. So yeah, Joe Marino, I'll let you initiate this topic. In about 10 minutes or less or thereabouts, what are some of the medical or forensic evidences that we have with the shroud images that show that whatever process formed these images, it must have involved a real human corpse?
Yeah, I might not need the 10 minutes because one of my biggest arguments is just the fact that if you take the number of doctors over the years that believe it's authentic as opposed to the doctors that think it could be that it's a fake, I mean, it's like 99 to 1 in favor of the doctors thinking it's authentic, going back decades. And in the modern age, you can take just like 2 doctors, both of whom are deceased right now, Dr. Robert Buckland from Stirp and Dr. Fred Zugby. Between the 2 of them, they probably did, this is probably a low estimate, they probably did 30 to 40,000 autopsies between them in their lifetime. And they both studied the shroud about 50 years, and they both believe that the shroud shows the authentic, physiologically and anatomically correct image of a crucified man. And if you've seen the Silent Witness movie by David Rolfe, they have Dr. Buckland in there, and I forget the first part of the quote, but he ends by saying, he's basically saying it's accurate, and he says, is beyond dispute. And it's just, this is anecdotal, this next part, but I think it says a lot. I was talking to Dr. Gus Aceta recently, and he's a medical doctor. He has a Shroud Center in California. He believes it's authentic. He told me the other day that he has asked hundreds of surgeons and pathologists about the image on the shroud. And while they may differ on, varying details, basically they told him that it's basically medically correct. So to me, it's just, again, it's the weight of the evidence sort of thing. I'm not a doctor, but when I see dozens and dozens and dozens of doctors saying, yeah, this is authentic, the blood flows are authentic, there's venous blood, there's arterial blood, this matches to a Roman crucifixion. There's a Dutch doctor that did a study on the medical aspects of Roman crucifixions. I think his name is Frans Wiffels, or Wijffels, I think. And they found the different characteristics that would happen to a victim of Roman crucifixion. And they listed about 12 characteristics that would happen to a man, and they found 11 of the 12 showing on the shroud. Now, I just don't think all these doctors are fooling themselves or want the shroud so bad to be authentic that they're, not seeing, or they're seeing things that aren't there. I think the weight of the evidence is so strong. You can only see halos from the blood serum only under ultraviolet light. There's things on there that you need modern instruments. I'll never forget, I asked Dr. Walter McCrone at a conference in 1986 how his supposed forger was able to incorporate details that couldn't even be known for several more centuries until the right instruments were invented. And his answer to me was, I'm not going to answer that. He just did it. Which to me is not a very scientific answer. I don't think he had an answer, so that's all he could come up with. So I've got dozens of doctors. I came across lots of names recently in different articles and stuff. And there's only, I think Dr. Michael Bodden from New York thinks it's fake. There's one or two others. There are not many medical people who think that the shroud is a fake image. They seem to feel that everything on there is medically, anatomically, and physiologically correct.
Okay, all right. And Hugh, why don't you give us, in 10 minutes or less, give us your take on the forensic and medical evidences. Why do you find them unconvincing in terms of the shroud involving a real human corpse?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily terribly difficult to produce something which looks as if it might have all the characteristics of a human corpse. There's some quite realistic crucifixions, and it would be interesting, even before they were specifically modelled on the shroud, but it'd be interesting to take a good anatomically correct, say, Italian or Spanish, because they seem to do it really well, and take it along to a doctor and say, obviously it's a wooden crucifixion, but can you say what's wrong with it from an anatomical point of view? And see if they could actually point out and say, well, it's only got 3 ribs when it should have so many, or that the length of the bones is wrong, or something like that. Because actually, I think people can draw or make very realistic looking dead bodies. And I think that, people have certainly said, we've got a list of 100 doctors. The number of that 100 doctors who've actually looked in detail at the shroud to try and find out exactly, shall we say, how the person was crucified, or exactly where the nails went and things like that, that's much, that's the far fewer of them. And when you start to find out what those people thought, turns out that the doctors all disagree with themselves. So if for example, we start with, I'm glad you mentioned Doctors Bucklin and Zugerby, both, as you say, superb forensic pathologists, worked for departments on opposite sides of the United States, probably the age-old battle between Los Angeles and New York, I think. There was Bucklin, who essentially agreed with Barbet that the nail in the hand passed through something called the space of Destot, which is a particular gap in between the bones of the wrist, and had the effect of damaging the median nerve, which would slam the thumb into the palms of the hands. Now, here was a highly qualified, highly experienced forensic pathologist who'd seen 30,000 dead bodies, describing exactly how the nail went into the hand. This was followed 3 years later by Fred Zugerby saying that Barbet in particular, but followed by Bucklin because he was of Barbet's school, literally had no idea what he was talking about. That the nail had not gone in through the space of Destot, but was on the other side of the hand, and that even if it had gone through the space of desktop, it wouldn't have damaged the median nerve because the median nerve isn't there. So once you get a couple of doctors actually examining specific anatomical details, they all disagree with each other. So it's all very well going, yeah, but in general it looks like a dead body. Yeah, of course it looks like a dead body. It was meant to look like a dead body. The artist wasn't an idiot. He carved his bas relief so that it had the anatomical configurations of a dead body. But as to exactly what configuration it was in, you get two doctors, they'll do nothing but squabble with each other. Over the last 5 years, I've been documenting 5 different ways in which the shroud clearly shows the nail has gone in through the wrist. Not only Bucklin and Zugby, but Giulio Fanti is sort of in charge of everything that happens in Italy, it seems to me, he and Paolo. But one of his team discovered that it hadn't gone in through that side, through either side of the wrist. It had gone through another space altogether. And somebody else suggested that it was further up between the 2 bones of the forearm, and somebody else that it was between the 2 middle bones of the 2 fingers. And all of these people were doctors. They all had reference to skeletons and x-rays and goodness knows what, and they all disagreed. So I'm not taken by necessarily the fact that a lot of doctors thought it was authentic doesn't convince me at all. They may, and it'd be nice to have got, yes, Dr. Barden and Dr. Zugby to discuss with each other why they thought the different things that they did. Bucklin and Zugby were outstanding because they were working professional forensic pathologists. So the only other one who could compare with them, to my mind, was Dr. Bonti. I think it was Bonti, who was a German, who was head of the German, forensic science department or something like that. And he, of course, thinks that the shroud, he thought, I'm not sure he's still alive, but he thinks that the shroud is, that the body in the shroud was alive, not dead. No, or maybe he thinks it's a fake. But one of them thought it was alive and not dead. And then there's the Spanish doctor, Miguel Lorente, and he thinks that the body in the shroud was alive and not dead. He's another forensic pathologist. So you get 5 forensic pathologists, all of whom agree that, in general, there was a dead body there, but get them to start describing it in detail, and they come to pieces. They can't decide how tall the chap was. At some point, they decided that his arms must have been dislocated in order to cover the groin. Other people have decided that he had, actually, Zugby retracted that slightly, that he had Marfan's syndrome, which is the kind of gigantism in which all your limbs get much longer than normal. So I'm not over impressed by the fact that a lot of doctors thought that the shroud comes from a real body.
Yeah, but that doesn't invalidate the fact that they agree on that it's a real dead body as opposed to it's an artistic image.
Well, I think they agree that it looks like a real dead body.
I really doubt that. In my old when I had 35 millimeter slides and I gave presentations, one of my slides was a 17th century diagram, medical diagram, and it was you could be on the floor laughing at how bad it was, and that was 17th century. I cannot imagine somebody in the 14th century knowing enough about medicine to be able to incorporate medical details that fool doctors and pathologists and surgeons in the 20th and 21st century.
Well, fair enough. I think he just did people were quite good at doing models of bodies, and they did models of bodies.
But I think most doctors would be able to tell an artistic image as opposed to a dead body. Possibly, but no, I think that I would like to talk to some of these people, and unfortunately, whenever I say I want to go and talk to a doctor, I immediately discover these died, which is a bit unfortunate. Yes, there's a lot of researchers that I quote in my paper that I have to say the late in front of.
Yeah, I have to grab them as soon as I can. Well, but you see my problem about the nail through the wrist. It'd be so interesting to listen to them saying why they think that. And if I was then to say, well, look, don't you think it could just have been splodged on at random and you're trying to derive some scientific meaning from it, I suspect they might go, yes, you might be right. A lot of the doctors worked from the assumption that it was a real body and then tried to derive how the blood would have got there, for example, assuming it was a real body. So all the people who were looking at blood flows running down the arms, for example. So I don't know, about 10 years ago, possibly even longer now, 20 years ago, was it Ricky? Not Rigi, but Ricky. Julia Ricky, he produced a statue, and they came up with this exact reason. In fact, we get to the Oviedo cloth here, but he produced this image of Christ and how Christ had died, and presumably he was working with best doctors of the time, and it shows Christ on the crucifix, hanging down with one arm stretched out, more or less horizontal but straight, and the other arm almost at right angles. Do you remember that crucifix? I think there were 2 or 3 of them were made.
Yeah.
Well, now, there are lots of other doctors who think that Jesus was in the shroud in rigor mortis. But there's no way that that image could be taken down from a crucifix and placed on the shroud in the way that, in the shroud configuration, having started like that, with so asymmetrical. I remember Mark Guskin doing this wonderful illustration of how the Sudarium of Oviedo was wrapped around the head of the body while it was dead on the cross, and saying that they managed to wrap the cloth halfway around the body, but then they couldn't get it through the head because the head was jammed against the arm because it had slumped down, and in rigor mortis it was so tight that they couldn't shove the cloth between, or they found it was indecent to shove the cloth between, so they folded it back, which is why the Sudarium of Oviedo is a doubled cloth, which makes perfect sense for the Sudarium, but it makes a complete mockery of the idea that why is Jesus' head perfectly symmetrical when it was finally placed in the tomb? Because rigor mortis would have jammed it over to one side. So again, you've got, I'd like to ask doctors, if it's realistic, why does this doctor disagree with you? And so on.
Okay, and Joe, are there any specific anatomical features that you think are inconsistent or wouldn't have been able to be duplicated by a medieval person? So in our show last week, Hugh mentioned Dicini, I think it was, a handbook, a medieval artist or a Renaissance artist.
Cennini.
There you go. You got the accent right. But yeah, and he has chapters on how to paint wounds and that sort of thing. So we do have some measure of an idea of what medievals thought. Is there anything depicted on the shroud anatomically that a medieval person wouldn't be able to, just observe and copy and that sort of thing?
Well, let's see. I think the scourge marks are pretty accurate. They match to the ends of they found the ends of a Roman flagrum in Herculaneum, and they reconstruct the handle to it. But the images, scourge wounds, match to that Roman flagrum found in Herculaneum. The wounds in the side.
No, they don't.
I'm sorry.
The scourge found in Herculaneum is only about 6 inches long, and it's completely disappeared. It was mentioned in a archaeological dictionary from about 1850 or so. But when Flavio Manservigi has done an enormous amount of work trying to find Roman flagrums, and of course we can't find anything that looks anything like the dumbbell-shaped marks on the shroud. And I think she's now admitted that there are 1 or 2 things which are called flagrums in the Vatican Museum, but it turns out that they are bits of metal trappings to hang down from the harnesses of horses and things like that. So no, there is no archaeological evidence for those dumbbell shapes on the shroud at all. The only 2 archaeological reconstructions which are often presented, there's very common photographs of a wooden handle with 3 leather thongs and 2 metal balls on the end, and you often see people in documentaries and movies on the shroud matching these balls to the marks on the shroud, going, look, they match absolutely, but nobody points out that those scourges were actually made deliberately to match the wounds on the shroud. They have no archaeological justification whatever.
Right. Well, I've also read that the sign in the wound matches to a Roman lancet at the time.
Yep, that does. I'll give you that.
Okay. And then I think one of the hardest characteristics for an artist to reproduce is the superficiality of the image, the fact that it's only on the top 1 or 2 microfibers. Each thread is made up of about 200 microfibers, and the image it resides only on the 1 to 2 top microfibers. I mean, that's a pretty good trick for a 14th century artist to do, especially over a 6-foot front image and a 6 or 5'10" maybe total front and back. The intensity is the same top to bottom throughout the cloth.
That's one of the reasons which makes me think that it's more likely to be constructed than come from a dead body, because dead bodies have all sorts of different materials about them, parts of them that are squishy, and the fingernails are quite hard, and the hair is stringy and that sort of thing, and yet we get exactly the same sort of image on the shroud regardless of the place on the body where it came from. And that strikes me as extremely difficult scientific miraculists to explain why hair should, I mean, even using the non-science, the naturalist miraculists, why hair should have exactly the same quality of emanation from it as, say, a nose or the ribs or something like that. It's the very evenness of the shroud that makes me think you've got a wooden bas relief lying down flat. You cover the whole thing with something, and you put the cloth on top, and you get the same stuff coming off. Now, as to the superficiality of things, I'm a bit confused about that in some ways. If you get a pencil and you scribble it on a piece of cloth, you'll discover that the pencil doesn't go through to the other side. It's just sitting there on the surface. Now, you'll say to yourself, yeah, but if you looked at that under a microscope, you'd have little fragments of pencil, you could see it. But if the pencil or a thickish paint or something like that had, as I said before, an acid component to it, then it would just sit on the surface of the cloth. There's no reason why it should seep in or do anything like that. So once you removed the colouring factor, you'd be left with discoloured material underneath.
I understand. Why wouldn't it seep in?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, try scribbling on it and see, or get a felt tip pen and just scribble it over a piece of cloth and see if it seeps in. Unless it's really wet, there's no reason why it should. Even wine's quite difficult to get that to go through. I was drawing a shroud in wine yesterday afternoon, as it happened, and I was surprised to find that it didn't go through the cloth.
Okay.
Cloth, you must remember that the shroud cloth is very, very dense. There's no holes in it. And that's, I mean, people think that you get a thing like a dishcloth or something like that, cotton, and it's full of holes. And you put water on one side, it comes straight through to the other. You get a linen cloth, much more difficult to get the paint to go through it.
Well, I've also heard that in some cases there's one fiber may be discolored and there may be a fiber right next to it that's not.
Yeah.
Which, that's kind of an odd characteristic as well.
Yes.
But to me, when I try to balance both sides, when you approach the shroud at the beginning, I think the default position should be, this is probably a fake, because that just sort of makes sense, But when you look at all the data, and if this shroud is authentic, it was there during the time, whatever the resurrection was, it was there and possibly show some effects from that. I still think, weighing all the evidence, both sides, I think it makes more sense to say the shroud was the only witness to the resurrection. Normally, the Jews wanted 2 and 3 witnesses to something, and if the Sudarium of Oviedo is authentic, that's a witness, and the empty tomb may be a witness. But the shroud was really the big witness to the resurrection. And I think it makes more sense to say, okay, I haven't figured out this image completely. I don't know if it's radiation or just a plain old miracle or whatever it was, but I believe it witnessed the resurrection. I think that makes more sense than some fantastic medieval artist who was able to fool all these people down through the centuries and incorporate all these details that we're finding still impossible to this day to duplicate. I mean, I just think the chances of an artist being able to do that is less than 1%.
Yeah, can I just pursue that? I think it was Russ Brewer. I thought it was really clever that the shroud was a kind of a receipt. I thought that was really good. But this witness thing, the shroud is a witness to the resurrection. So who, and people going on about the Jews requiring 2 or 3 witnesses, is that right?
Right.
It's the Jews who needed them. It's not modern people who have a specific requirement for witnesses. So what I want to know is that if this was a particular Jewish requirement, then why on earth did the Jews, who were definitely trying to prove that Jesus had resurrected, not produce their witness?
Because it was an impure object, and if they brought it out, the shroud would have been destroyed, and they could have been arrested and crucified themselves.
But this was we're talking the Acts of the Apostles here. They were going around announcing that Jesus had been resurrected. They weren't ashamed of that, and they didn't mind being arrested and put into prison. But they had the opportunity of not just announcing that Jesus was resurrected, but actually producing a witness, and they didn't.
Well, they may have, I think DeWesselo feels that the appearance to the 500, I think he thinks that was the showing of the shroud. There's an interesting quote in Galatians that I think could be a reference to the shroud. Of course, it depends on what translation you use, but I think the New International Version, Galatians 3:1, it starts out something like, "Oh, you foolish Galatians, how are you deceived?" And then there's a phrase toward the end of the verse where it says, "You who before Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." And I found that interesting, because what could that mean in the first century? Publicly portrayed as crucified. I think that's a possible reference to the shroud.
Yeah, it certainly sounds good. I'd have to find out what the word for portrayed actually was. I mean, whether it meant that he just announced that he was crucified, or whether there was some image that he produced. Things like it's very easy. These translations, you have to go back to the Latin to check it out, really, and the Greek indeed.
Okay.
But it might be right. Yeah, it sounds possible.
Okay. One thing I have for you, Hugh, and my audience will kill me. Some of the skeptics in the audience want to know about. Are there any anatomical inaccuracies that you think suggest it probably didn't involve a body? So you mentioned something about the long arms, which is again for Tyler B. That's a big one for him. And other skeptics mentioned some of these anatomical inaccuracies. So I just wanted to get your take. Do you think there are any examples of these that rule out the use of a human body? And then let's see how Joe comes back.
Well, I can see how Joe will come back, because, of course, this was the problem from the start, is that although you look at the body and think it's great, it looks exactly right. But as a matter of fact, if you look at almost any picture, we have a tendency to assume that it's a real, if you look at a photoshopped person of a person, you have a tendency to assume it shows a person, a genuine person, even though it may have been somewhat manipulated. I know that in the during just after the war, 1948, things like that, when they wanted to advertise tights, they would get pretty girls wearing tights, and they would make their legs quite ridiculously up to about 20% longer than they really were. But nobody knew that. Nobody really appreciated that because they all looked just, it's very pretty with long legs. So it's amazing how much a person looking at a picture of a body will give it realism on the grounds that that's what a body looks like. So we'll add bits to it, and they don't mind that you get fooled by an irregular shape. So the first time you get someone like Pierre Barbet, who looked at the body and says absolutely perfect in all respects, and then you get John Jackson and his team, who practiced laying the shroud down over a body, completely flat, lying down on a bench, and they thought that they could get the shroud and it matched perfectly, and they did that wonderful shroud with all little squares all over it to see if they could get the exact distance between the body and the cloth and all the rest of it. And then that all worked very nicely until along comes Isabel Pixek, who says, no, it shows foreshortening. The man had his knees bent. Well, no one had thought of that before. So you've got a picture of Isabel Pixek standing on the top of a ladder, looking down at somebody lying on the floor with his knees slightly bent and his head a little bit up. And then we discover that doesn't give you a sufficiently accurate rendition. So now you've got the Italians who've produced all these models recently with a person sort of doubled up into a kind of zigzag shape with his knees high and his whole of his upper body lifted up so as to conform with the image on the shroud. So, even the people who believe it was definitely Jesus realize that the image doesn't match what ought to be a straight body lying in a tomb.
Okay. And Joe, what do you make of some of these anatomical inaccuracies? Are they good evidence that it didn't belong to a body? And specifically the long arms is something that'll mean a lot to the audience too. So, yeah, how do you come back on that?
Well, I know some people have said that his arms would have been stretched a bit to put the nails in. I don't know about that, but again, an analogy would be like, if somebody's diagnosed with cancer and they go to 10 different doctors and they get 10 different treatments, the fact that those treatments different, that the doctors think something will work, that doesn't take away the fact that you got the cancer. So I mean, you might. I'd be surprised if all the doctors that looked at it agreed on 100% of the characteristics that they're seeing. That's just not going to happen. I think the bottom line is whether there's a dead body there or not, as opposed to an artistic image. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think the weight of the evidence, of the medical opinion of people that have studied, and let's be clear, the shroud is probably the most intensely studied artifact in human history, not just relic, artifact in terms of the number of hours people have put into it. I think this is as of a few years ago. I think John Jackson had spent in his own life at least about 40,000 hours studying the shroud. And you see all these other people that have studied it 40 and 50 years. And the Stirp team were people that worked in the space and nuclear programs. I think those guys were bright enough that if it was an artistic image, they would have found out pretty quickly. Barry thought he was going to see the paint and go home in 5 minutes. Ray Rogers says, I'll have this thing shot full of holes in 30 minutes. Well, here we are, 40-something years later, and we're still debating the evidence. And most people that have spent a goodly amount of time on the shroud, most of them think it's authentic. And I have to say that for most skeptics, and I'm not including you in this group, but I think most skeptics that say it's a fake have an agenda. I think they're afraid, especially if they're atheist or agnostic. If the shroud's authentic, that's going to be a problem for their worldview. Whereas Christians, Maybe a few people go overboard with it, but most people would not stop becoming Christians if they found out the shroud was a fake. So I think most of the skeptics that come at this have an agenda where it's just it's an icing on the cake sort of thing for most Christians.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay, and just before we close out, so are both parties happy with the coverage of that topic, or does anyone have any last words on this?
No, I'm happy to go along. I will just say one thing, and that is, I agree with what Joe's just said. I think a lot of skeptics probably do have an agenda. Although, to be perfectly honest, there aren't a lot of us, as far as I know. Presumably, most skeptics don't study the shroud in the first place. No, I would say, I mean, Joe was saying that of having considered all the evidence, as far as he's concerned, based on weighing it all up, he's convinced that the shroud is authentic. And I really respect that. There's nothing wrong with that. And I've never stopped, I've never tried to say that people are idiots or that they were wrong, or, well, I said they were wrong, but, I don't condemn their beliefs. He's dead right. There are lots of people who think exactly that. I'm just one of the ones that doesn't. I liked Barry, is always often quotes the fact that somebody came up to him at the end of a lecture and said, "Mr. Schwartz, you'll never persuade me that what you say is true." And he just goes, "Well," I'm sure he said this on your show when he was here.
He did, yeah.
He says, "Do you think I care what you think?" I don't want to persuade you. I just want to tell you what the facts are, and you can make it up for yourself. You can decide for yourself. And yeah, I'm very happy to tell people what I think. But far be it from me to tell everybody else that what they think is, they shouldn't be allowed to believe it.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, I think that basically covers the entire show there and all three of the main topics. Hopefully both guests were happy with the conversation. Yeah, perfect.
I'm happy. One more thing.
Yeah, Joe. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
At the beginning, I forgot to mention, I did write a book in 2011 called Wrapped Up in the Shroud, Chronicle of a Passion. I like puns, so that's a pun. It refers to me metaphorically and to Jesus in actuality.
Perfect. And just for the audience, I have that'll be in the sources. There's a link to the Amazon thing to get the book there. So yeah, sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, if you have the link there, it probably doesn't matter. But for some reason, if you look up under Amazon under my name, it won't come up, but it does come up under the title.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, hopefully the audience enjoyed that, and yeah, have a good week, everybody. Thanks for being on, guys.
Okay. Cheers, man.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.